Zoe and I are going to try to explain today how constitutional recognition and the push for a First Nations voice in the Constitution goes together with empowerment and the closing the gap agenda. The two things are part of the same picture. So I'm just quickly going to take you through a bit of where we've come from, why Indigenous people for so many decades have been advocating for constitutional reform, and the journey that we went through at Cape York Institute in terms of political strategy and trying to get traction. Thank you, Kerry. So first of all, the Constitution was made in 1901 by a bunch of white guys. This was when the representatives of the colonies came together and decided that they wanted to create one unified nation, the Commonwealth of Australia. So essentially, the Constitution is a power-sharing compact. It's all about power. It shares out power across our country. It says, Commonwealth government, you get this much power. High Court, you get this much power. The states, you get this much power. But the problem was the Constitution, those negotiations, those power-sharing negotiations, didn't have any First Nations representatives involved at all, even though they had owned this land for thousands and thousands of years. And so the Constitution that those white guys came up with didn't include any recognition of the First Nations, didn't include any protection of Indigenous rights. Unlike lots of other Western democracies, Australia doesn't have a Bill of Rights. So there's no guarantee of equal treatment before the law in the Australian Constitution. Unlike New Zealand, there's no reserved Indigenous seats. Unlike Canada, there's no guarantee of Indigenous treaty rights in the Constitution. There was no Indigenous treaty in the settlement of Australia. So what the Constitution did, it set up a really unfair power relationship. It gave the governments all the power, and it gave the 3% Indigenous minority, the mouse and the elephant, as Noel talks about. The mouse had no power, the 97% elephant had all the power. So it created this position of perpetual powerlessness, or what the Uluru Statement calls the torment of our powerlessness. So, and that powerlessness has been evidenced all throughout the history over the decades, because the Australian Parliament has all this power to make whatever laws and policies it likes about Indigenous people, and very often throughout our history, as you know, many of those laws and policies have been unfair and discriminatory. Apart from the history of violence and attempted genocide that Noel writes about so powerfully in A Rightful Place, there were laws denying Indigenous people the vote in some jurisdictions. During my PhD research, I found out this story about an Indian man in Victoria, where I grew up, who challenged his exclusion from voting, challenged the Commonwealth law, because in those times it wasn't only Indigenous people, other non-white people were also prevented from voting. He went off to court to, say to the Commonwealth, come on, you should give me the right to vote. So the Commonwealth changed the Commonwealth Franchise Act to give Indian people the right to vote, but not Indigenous people, who didn't get equal voting rights until many decades later. And of course, laws saying that children could be removed and families can be split up in the protection era, mission, forcibly removing people to missions, and of course, laws denying Indigenous property rights. Next one. So then the 1967 referendum, Australia's most successful referendum, what it did was it gave the Commonwealth the power to make laws about Indigenous affairs, because previously that was just a state matter, and it also removed some of the explicit exclusions of Indigenous people from the Constitution. And that was succeeded with a 90% yes vote. Now, the interesting thing is, at the time, there was this Liberal MP called Billy Wentworth who said, now hang on, if we're giving the Commonwealth the power to make laws about Indigenous people, shouldn't we make sure that those laws are not discriminatory? Shouldn't we make sure they're only good laws, not bad laws? And he said we should put a racial non-discrimination guarantee in the Constitution, an equality guarantee. The government said, no, let's not do that, because we don't want to give the High Court power to strike down our laws. So they didn't do that. All they did was they gave the Commonwealth power to make laws about Indigenous people with no guarantee that those laws should be just and fair and non-discriminatory. So the problem was the 1967 referendum didn't fix that imbalanced power relationship problem. It still confirmed that government had all the power to make laws and policies about Indigenous people, but it didn't guarantee those laws should be fair, and it didn't give Indigenous people any power to challenge those laws or to even have a fair say in the laws that government might make about them. Next one. So, back one, yep. So when you look around the world at different countries that have Indigenous minority populations in them, there are basically 4 ways that those countries balance up that power relationship. And one way is through bills of rights, as I mentioned, through equality guarantees and guaranteeing Indigenous rights in the Constitution. Another way is through representative mechanisms, so whether that's reserved seats for Indigenous people in Parliament, like in New Zealand, or through Indigenous representative bodies, like in Canada, they've got the Assembly of First Nations, and in Scandinavia, in Finland and Sweden and those types of countries, they've got Sami parliaments, so Sami advisory bodies to enable Indigenous people to have a say in laws and policies made about them. And the 4th way they do it is through cultural and language recognition. So back in 2014, Fiona and I and other Indigenous leaders, along with this constitutional conservative, Damien Freeman, we went off to New Zealand and to look at the way Maori were recognised in New Zealand. And one thing that really struck us was the way the New Zealand people make Maori heritage front and centre of their national identity. So in New Zealand law, Maori is recognised as an official language of New Zealand. And there's a Maori Language Commission. And as you know, I don't know how many of you watched the recent Adam Goodes documentary, but you know, the outrage when we saw Adam Goodes give a 2-second Aboriginal war dance on the football field compared with the pride that New Zealand has when the All Blacks do their haka. You know, so Australia doesn't have any of those 4 things. So that's the problem that constitutional recognition seeks to address. And Indigenous people have been asking for constitutional reform to give them more power in this relationship for decades and decades, ever since the 1920s or probably before. They've been asking in letters to the King sometimes, petitions to the Prime Minister, asking for things like reserved seats, an Indigenous representative body. The Barunga Statement in 1988 that was given to Bob Hawke, people often remember that as asking for a treaty, but it also asked for an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander representative body. And after that, ATSIC was enacted, but the problem was ATSIC was set up in legislation, and when John Howard came into power, ATSIC got struck down. Next one. So, you know, lots of the politicians, they want to keep saying all that constitutional recognition seeks to achieve is a symbolic statement. Something nice and poetic in the preamble saying Indigenous people were here first, that's enough. But Indigenous people have consistently been saying, no, we want empowerment. We want the Constitution to better protect our rights and our interests. We want it to address the elephant and the mouse problem so that we have more power in this relationship. So it's never been just about symbolism for Indigenous people. And why should the recognition be in the Constitution? Well, Galarrwuy Yunupingu explained this very well. He said, if our rights were recognised in the Constitution, it wouldn't be so easy for government to change the laws all the time and wipe out our rights. Now, that's the key thing to understand about the Constitution. Because you need a referendum to change the Constitution, anything you put in there is much more locked in than things in ordinary legislation. So that's why the Uluru Statement asks for a voice in the Constitution, because unlike ATSIC, which was set up in legislation and then can be abolished via legislation as well, they want something that is more stable and enduring and guaranteed. Yep. So back in 2012, soon after I started working at Cape York Institute, Noel and I, despite the lessons of 1967, which we were naively not alive to back then, we said, right, what there should be is a racial non-discrimination clause in the Constitution. And we pushed for that, and the expert panel at that time took on board a lot of our recommendations. But we hadn't anticipated the political reality. So when the expert panel report came out, there was lots of pushback from the political right saying, no, this is a one-clause Bill of Rights. We don't want the High Court to strike down Parliament's laws. So all the same arguments that were made in 1967. They didn't want it to undermine parliamentary supremacy, and they thought it would create too much legal uncertainty. Next one. And we realised that in order for constitutional reform to succeed, it's not enough just to have the progressive side of politics on board. Because it's so hard to achieve constitutional reform, only 8 out of 44 referendums have succeeded in Australia. The history shows that they really only succeed if you have both sides of politics on board. And so Noel's advice to us then was, we need to plant a stake at, say, 5 o'clock on the political spectrum. We need to come up with a proposal that the conservative right can support and champion. And in theory, if we do that, in theory, because progressives are supposed to be more open to reform than conservatives, everybody to the left should be more amenable to the reform. Next one. And so this is the challenge that Noel laid out for Cape York Institute. He said, we need to figure out a way to step to the right and up. Given we've only got this very narrow window of political opportunity, and given the expert panel's proposals, position 1 there, might be a little bit too far to the left, just outside the window. It's a bit too much to the left to succeed. How do we move the proposal to the right without sliding it down to minimalism? Because the problem is, as soon as you start taking away the substantive things in the expert panel's proposal, all you're left with is a symbolic statement. And the problem with a symbolic statement is that it all slides down to something that's too weak. Indigenous people won't support it. And if Indigenous people don't support it, what's the point? But also, Australians probably won't support a proposal for Indigenous recognition if Indigenous people don't want it. So we needed to step to the right and up. And that's how this proposal for a First Nations body in the Constitution came about. We kind of went through this really quite extraordinary process of reaching out to our opponents, to the very constitutional conservatives who opposed our push for a racial non-discrimination clause. We actually had enlightening conversations with them where we said, come on guys, the Constitution has presided over a lot of discrimination. How can we figure out a way of addressing that problem that doesn't empower the High Court? And so the alternative proposal we came up with was, maybe instead of empowering the High Court to decide what's a good and bad law, can we empower Indigenous people themselves to have a fairer say in the laws and policies that are made about them? And that's how this concept of a First Nations body in the Constitution came about. And the package of reforms we started to advocate for was a body or a voice in the Constitution, keep the symbolic statements outside the Constitution in a declaration, and have some kind of settlements commission or treaty-making commission set up in legislation. Yep. And when you think about the two proposals, as we started advocating for this, some Indigenous groups pointed out that actually a voice might be a more empowering proposition than a protection against racial non-discrimination. Because if you think about it, they said, a voice is more like a sword, whereas a racial non-discrimination clause is more like a shield. With a voice, you can have input and a say before a law gets enacted, while the policy is being developed, whereas with a racial non-discrimination clause, you have to go off to the High Court after the policy is being enacted and try to get it struck down. So in 2015, Professor Anne Toomey at Sydney University came up with this clause. So these could be the kinds of words that might go into the Constitution if this were to succeed. There shall be an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander body to be called the, and one of the ideas that the Conservatives we worked with came up with was maybe you give it an Indigenous name. Maybe you can put that in the Constitution. And this Parliament shall legislate to set up the body, and the body will be able to give advice to Parliament and the Executive in the making of laws and policies with respect to Indigenous affairs. So when we went into the Uluru Convention, and what the Referendum Council did was conduct these dialogues with First Nations representatives all around the country, and they assessed these options. They assessed a racial non-discrimination clause, they assessed a symbolic statement in the Constitution, and they assessed a First Nations voice in the Constitution. And I'll just show you some of the pictures from the... You can see this is the final Uluru Convention, where all the delegates there. They did amazing work over 3 days, and this was some of the traditional dances. It was a really fantastic experience. And the Uluru Statement asked for 2 things. First, it asked for a First Nations voice to be enshrined in the Constitution. Second, it asked for a Makarrata Commission, or agreement-making, treaty-making commission, to be set up in legislation. And the Uluru Statement was amazing because it basically exploded this false dichotomy that had been hampering this debate for years, really, between a treaty on the one hand and constitutional recognition on the other hand. And you all probably remember that debate. There were lots of people who used to say, oh, you know, constitutional recognition's too weak, a treaty's, you know, that's the good thing, it's strong and empowering, and it was one or the other. You either had to be in one camp or the other. Well, I think the Uluru Statement changed all that because it said, no, we want both. We want constitutional recognition through a voice, and we want a treaty. And when you think about it, it makes sense to ask for both, because down in Victoria, they're going through a treaty process at the moment, but what's the first thing they had to do? They didn't go straight into negotiating the treaty. First of all, they created a First Nations voice for Victoria so that there would be an institution, a representative structure that could negotiate the treaty. And when you look at all the structural reforms that the Uluru Statement and the Referendum Council asked for, it looks something like this. First Nations voice in the Constitution, a Makarrata Commission to supervise agreement making, and the Referendum Council also ignited this idea of a declaration outside the Constitution. Now, when I think back to our trip in New Zealand, I imagine, you know, a Makarrata Commission could be something like the Waitangi Tribunal. A declaration, depending on what's in it, and maybe I'm being too imaginative, but if a declaration has some really good stuff in it, and if all the Australian Parliament signed up to it, as the Referendum Council recommended, and if there was a First Nations voice that also signed up to it, depending on what was in that declaration, could that be something like a treaty? So could that be our version of the Treaty of Waitangi, and this our version of the Waitangi Tribunal, and this our version of the Maori Council, but enshrined in the Constitution? So, despite the great thing that was achieved by the First Nations through the Uluru Statement from the Heart, unfortunately that was Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull's response. He rejected the Uluru Statement outright. And the cartoons at the time just encapsulate it perfectly, because it was almost like the politicians, they were still in their symbolic little bubble. Scott Morrison talks a lot about the bubble. Well, they're still wanting their symbolism. And so, in a way, what came out of Uluru, even though it wasn't new for the Indigenous people, it was new for some of those politicians. Yep. Go again. And so, for a while, it seemed like the Uluru Statement was put in the too hard basket, their very big too hard basket. And around that time, the Prime Minister echoed the objections of the Institute of Public Affairs and Andrew Bolt. And he said, this proposal for a First Nations voice is contrary to the principle of equality, which is ironic, given that his side of politics rejected our previous proposal for an equality guarantee in the Constitution. There is no equality, in fact, under Australia's constitution. In fact, there's discriminatory clauses in there, and the High Court has confirmed we don't have a Bill of Rights. There's no equality guarantee in the constitution. And in fact, as former High Court Justice Murray Gleeson explained recently, even our democratic representation doesn't abide to the principle of equality. If you're a Tasmanian, you get a greater proportionate say in the governance of the country than a Victorian, because that's the way federalism works, right? So that equality objection is very dishonest. And then Barnaby Joyce came up with the line, a third chamber of parliament. He said, no, this will be a third chamber, which is also not true, because the voice would not have a veto power. It would be a voice to Parliament, not in Parliament, so a representative advisory body, not a new chamber of Parliament. They also argued that we don't need a voice because the Indigenous MPs are the First Nations voice, they're already in Parliament. But if you think about it, well, they have to represent their constituents, just like any politician of any ethnicity has to represent all Australians. And there are other objections, like it's too short on detail, it's too late in the process, Australians won't support it. So that was in 2017, now we're in 2019. And I think, amazingly, there is still a lot of hope. So one thing that the Turnbull's rejection of Uluru did was it actually galvanised the left. So suddenly, because a Liberal Prime Minister rejected it, Labor got passionately supportive, a bit late in the day, but now they are, Anthony Albanese was really behind the Uluru Statement at Garma, it sounds like. It also galvanised Australians, and there have been 3 or 4 sets of polling done since then, that the most recent one showed 66% support a First Nations voice in the Constitution. Now you compare that to the same-sex marriage postal survey, that was 61% support, but that was with the Prime Minister arguing yes for the change. Now 66% support in the face of 2 years of government opposition. Imagine how high it would be if we had a supportive government. There was a Joint Select Committee report in 2018 chaired by Patrick Dodson and Julian Leeser in the Liberal Party. He was one of the Conservatives we actually worked with to develop this proposal. And despite Turnbull's rejection, they said this is the only way forward in constitutional recognition. The amazing thing, Barnaby Joyce said he was wrong to call it a third chamber, and he apologised unreservedly. So that is amazing, because it shows that when you keep explaining it's not right, eventually it can sink in and people can change their minds. And of course, Murray Gleeson gave a powerful speech supporting the proposal, and he is a very respected former High Court judge. I'll leave it there and hand over to Zoe.
So we're standing here in Cape York looking at the horizon of Indigenous affairs. What can we see? We can see Cape York welfare reform started more than 10 years ago. So we've had 10 years of that, and this was an initiative that was about our right to take responsibility, a responsibilities agenda, empowerment, yeah? And it was about structural reform. The FRC gives real power to Indigenous people on the ground that they otherwise wouldn't have to actually make change. And it was also developed through co-design. Also, about 10 years ago, we got the Closing the Gap targets, and we all know that is not succeeding very well. So the latest account, Prime Minister stands up every year in Parliament and provides an annual report. Only 2 of those targets are on track. So more than 10 years of effort, and we're really not doing very well in terms of the targets themselves. The crises in areas like Indigenous incarceration, juvenile detention, and youth suicide continue to get worse. So more than $34 billion spent in Indigenous affairs, and we are failing to close the gap. So there is a refresh process going on at the moment. It's been going on for some time now, and it looks like we're about to add to our unsuccessful attempt to achieve the current targets, a bunch of new targets coming out of the Closing the Gap process. So back in 2014-15, obviously we were very concerned, Indigenous leaders around the country very concerned that there wasn't the progress that we should be seeing made on closing the gap. And they got together to really say, what can we do about this? How can we do better at closing the gap? And we need to be empowered to make better decisions for ourselves, to be more effective in using that $34 billion to close the gap. And that was the Empowered Communities report. We got some support from the Australian government to implement some parts of that thinking in empowered communities, that method for empowerment. So they didn't come at all of it, but they said you can go ahead and start to implement some of the stuff in the regions. Then Shireen's talked to you about the Uluru Statement from the Heart, and that very clear rejection of symbolic reform only for constitutional recognition. And I think it's very telling. The content of the statement talks about closing the gap. It talks about those crises that people are facing and the need for structural reform. We did Palmer Futures. So Palmer Futures in Cape York, done with many, many Cape York people through a co-design process, is empowered communities in Cape York. It took the empowered communities thinking and said, how do we really get this going in Cape York? How do we design this thing so that we can really move things along in Cape York? Yep. Then we had Queensland Government. It's thriving communities. There wasn't much detail. So at the same time as we were doing Palmer Futures and working with people across the Cape to develop those ideas, the Queensland Productivity Commission was doing a report into service delivery in Indigenous communities. And we think it's a fantastic report, a really good report. It picks up most of the thinking in the Empowered Communities report that was already done. And Thriving Communities is the Queensland Government response. So Thriving Communities says Queensland Government is going to commit to structural reform and commit to local decision making. So the words are good, but there's very little detail, only about 8 pages. So a lot less detail than was even in that Queensland Productivity Commission report that it's responding to. And then most recently, the Queensland Government has announced its Tracks to Treaty process. So again, a big announcement. There's going to be a process in place to move towards a treaty. And so Jackie Huggins, Michael Lavarch, and Kerry O'Brien are going to lead the eminent persons panel that will move us towards a treaty process in Queensland. Before the federal election, the Liberal Party released an Indigenous policy, and there's a few significant things about it. It really endorses empowered communities. It says this is the policy for empowerment. So for the first time ever, a really strong endorsement of empowerment is the policy, the way to go. It also says we will implement the recommendations of the Joint Select Committee that Shireen talked about. So it says we'll pursue constitutional reform, and that Joint Select Committee report very clearly was careful to leave the door open on the voice. It also commits money to do a co-design process, so to co-design for local and regional decision making. And then obviously the other very significant thing is we have a new minister at the federal level, Ken Wyatt, first Indigenous Affairs Minister who is Indigenous himself, and there he is at Gama on the weekend. So it's his job to try and navigate all of this, very difficult job. Who would want to be him? Not me, but we'll try and help him along the way. So that's sort of where we are now. So, yep. So I don't know how that makes you feel. You might feel excited. Constitutional reform just there, treaty, that could be exciting, local and regional decision making. Or you might be going, oh my God, how does this all fit together? Does it fit together? How do we get through this? So that's sort of what I want to talk about a bit today, is how it can all fit together. So yes, I think we have agreement on some really important things where we want to get to. We want to close the gap. No one disagrees with closing that gap on life expectancy or closing that gap on education. Yep. And I think we're at a point where we all agree that to do that, to close the gap, we need a better partnership. Government needs a better partnership with Indigenous people. And Prime Ministers in Australia have now been saying this for a long time in those closing the gap addresses. They get up every year and they say, oh, you know, it's not working. We need a better partnership to get there. We need to do things with you, not to you. So there's been a series of Prime Ministers that have made those statements. Just go back. And it's about getting this power balance right. So whether you call it empowerment, whether you call it responsibility, whether you call it self-determination, all the same thing. How do we move from government having all the power to Indigenous people being able to take up that responsibility and be in a more equal partnership with government? Yep. I think the other thing that there's more and more agreement is that this top-down approach of government making all the decisions in Canberra, in Brisbane, doesn't work on the ground. We see a lot of duplication, we see a lot of inefficiency, we see a lot of crazy decisions made in Canberra and Brisbane about what is needed in Hopevale or Arakoon or Lockhart or Cowan. So I think there's agreement that we have to push some of that decision making so that it's made on the ground, so we need more of a bottom-up approach. It's not a simplistic bottom-up approach though, and I think that's part of our worry with Queensland Government's Thriving Communities approach, is they've got a view that you just hand over, local people then can make all the decisions perhaps. I mean, they haven't done that yet, but they're taking a simplistic idea. Well, people on the ground don't have all the answers either. It's not about that, it's not a simplistic approach. But certainly what we need to do is we need to get decision making, we need to get a system that allows, authority and decisions to percolate up. So we don't want to replace a top-down government decision making with a top-down Indigenous decision making approach either. We don't want a national voice where a bunch of people sit at the national level and tell people in Cape York what to do. And certainly in the lead up to the Uluru Statement from the Heart, that was the Indigenous aspiration. They don't want just a group of people sitting at that national level making decisions for them. So somehow we've got to move to a bottom-up approach. That's what we're trying to do. So we have a look at how well aligned we are. So closing the gap, Indigenous communities, yes, we want to close the gap. Australian government, yes, yes, yes. Better partnership, yes, 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 yes. Bottom up, yes, I think everyone can agree that that's the way to go to. And that is totally aligned with all the evidence about development across the world. It doesn't work unless the people who are, you're trying to benefit are involved in the decisions made against them. So hooray, everything's aligned. But no. So we're all aligned, I think, on where we want to get to. Just go back. It's that mountain over there. We're not there yet. So we've got a lot of work to do. So in terms of how to get there, there isn't a map. We're in uncharted territory. So we have to work it out as we go. We certainly know a few things. Constitutional recognition, we've had 15 years in this country of multi-partisan commitment to constitutional recognition for Indigenous people. Structural reform. So I think there's good recognition at every level of government now that that's part of the answer, and it's got to deliver this empowerment if we're going to get there. So when we talk about closing the gap, we have to think about, both government changing and Indigenous people organising. So it's both sides. It's not just one or the other. And in between there, yep. So we talk about this interface. We're creating a new interface. So part of this better partnership is how do both sides come together in a more equal partnership, where we think the structural reform here is about creating new interface to let that partnership be a much better partnership. Yep. So I just want to talk about the scale of the change that we're trying to achieve here. It's huge. It's really big. We had a go at trying to describe the scale of the change we're asking from government in the Empowered Communities report. We said it's a profound change. We need to shift the centre of gravity about how government does its business with Indigenous people. And we likened it a bit to the national competition reforms that moved away from kind of protectionist economic policy to competition policy. So it's a big, big change for government. They've got to give up their thinking about management, protection and control of Indigenous people and Indigenous communities. They've got to give up thinking they can fix it, and they've got to shift to being more of an enabler. And of course, there's vested interests. We've got to change cultures and mindsets along the way. So it's a big, and the QPC agreed. They said, yep, it's a big change for government. The current system is fundamentally broken. This is talking about now the kind of how Indigenous people have to organise. And that's a big change too. And I think this statement that Paul Keating made to Noel during the native title negotiations is a really interesting one. And he's talking about the adaptive leadership challenge that faces Indigenous people. So he said, and I'll let you read the statement, but he's really talking about, we all know, 250 years ago in this country, there were many, many First Nation groups, clans and families, and really complex social structures and decision makings were in place. 250 years, a lot of impact has happened to those decision making structures and social structures, and the impact's been different in different places. So different in Arnhem Land to Cape York, different to Brisbane, different to Tasmania. So we've got a situation now where obviously people have traditional rights in country and language and culture that needs to be respected. But we also have a situation where there's been intermarriage, people may not live on their ancestral lands. So how do Indigenous people organise for the contemporary reality that is today? And I think Galarrwuy put it very well. He talked about how do we create a modern version of ourselves. So he's not suggesting here in any way that Indigenous people aren't fully modern. He's saying how do we come to grips with the contemporary reality in this global world we live in, respect our traditional culture and heritage, but organise ourselves to be part of this partnership in Australia. So how do we get there? We're making the plan. The next step is, like in that Liberal policy, we need government to adopt it as policy. Empowerment is the policy. We want to see that then embedded in legislation and ultimately get the hook in the Constitution, the voice enshrined in the Constitution, so Indigenous people will always have a guaranteed seat at the table. So Palmer Futures was about here, making the plan. So Palmer Futures really started to try and build what might these partnership processes, structures look like from the ground up. And there was a lot of work done, and it's still going on through summits, labs, further summits, and still happening. And it's no coincidence, obviously, that in Palmer Futures we're trying to close the gap. Empowerment's very central, and this governance and enablement is all really central to how do we organise in Cape York to close the gap with these work streams of land rights and economic development. So one of the significant things I think Palmer Futures does is it starts to say, okay, Cape York could get organised into sub-regions, 12 sub-regions across Cape York. And this isn't just about focusing on the town areas, it's about acknowledging people have land rights now recognised in the areas outside of town. So we need to bring that into the development story and the planning and the decision making that goes on. So this is the crux of it, really. So out of Palmer Futures, people said, okay, so we need to start with grassroots empowerment. People have always had these family conversations that helps to build strong decision making around the campfire, and that needs to continue. These family discussions are the basis of empowerment. So empowerment fundamentally has to happen at the individual and family level, and people need to keep doing that because that is the foundation. The structural reforms that we can build on top of that at the community level are about holding twice yearly community planning forums. So these are open forums where everyone can come and have their say about planning and priorities. They would then lead into community negotiation tables. So this is the interface with government at the community level. So it's a tripartite arrangement. So you have federal government, state government, and community reps. So the community reps are decided by the people who've participated in the planning forum. So it's up to them who sits at that table to negotiate, and it might depend on what the focus of the table is, or you might have some land reps, some empowerment reps, and some economic development reps. And that's where they can actually sit down and make decisions, negotiate investment, negotiate service delivery for their community in a way that's right for their local context and circumstances. Now, you remember I said we're wanting to get to bottom-up decision making, but we can't be simplistic. Not everything can be dealt with at the local level. Government can't come in and co-design every program at a local level. It's just impossible. And also we need policies to change and we need laws to change. So we need to be percolating things up through the system. So the regional level is going to be really important. This might be the level where some of those, that co-design, for example, occurs. So again, we would say, that this has to be fair representation. There has to be fair geographical representation of all the areas across Cape York at that regional level. So the proposal is for a male and a female elected representative to be part of this interface at the regional level. So again, a tripartite interface, federal government, state government, community reps, 2 from each sub-region, a male and a female, elected, so fair and transparent processes. Those arrangements then could be recognised by government, and government could then start to really devolve decision-making down through those arrangements to the regional and local level. So you can see out of all of this, some principles start to emerge. Traditional owners need to be respected, but we want to take an inclusive approach. Making service delivery decisions about Hopevale, everyone should be able to have their say, not just traditional owners. And yes, we want fair and open and transparent processes. Yep. So again, I quite like this little puzzle metaphor. We're building these community empowerment pieces, which then fit together into a regional partnership. You could see how then we could build the puzzle out to the Queensland level and maybe have a Queensland voice and then a national level. So what we're talking about ultimately is we get the constitutional recognition of a voice, so that hook in the Constitution, it's there. The details would be set out in legislation, and it could be a piece of legislation, perhaps 2 pieces of legislation, depending on how it's staged. But the legislation would set out the common principles and frameworks, but it would be up to each region to design its own arrangements that plug into that legislation, that get recognised then and allow for that regional and local decision making to happen. Yep. So you can start to imagine as regions get recognised around Australia, and so Cape York would have 2 elected representatives go to a national voice, a male and a female. If we took the ATSIC regions across Australia as a starting point, and they might need to shift, but you would end up then with 70 representatives on a national voice, there being 35 ATSIC regions across Australia. So you can start to see how at a national level those people might come together a couple of times a year to fulfil their functions, but they might also have a central policy committee, if you like, with some subcommittees working on particular issues, whether it's education or health. But their job would not be to make decisions on policy and legislation across the nation, but to tap into those regional and community partnership and empowerment structures. So the Cape York reps might be asked, what's your view on a particular piece of legislation or policy? And they would be able to access the voices and the opinions of people in the Cape York region. So the idea is not that we're going for kind of consensus, everyone doesn't have to think the same thing, but that government at both the state level and the federal level can tap into the different voices at regional and community level. Yep. So, I suppose what I wanted you to take away, thinking about all this is all connected. Closing the gap is not separate to constitutional recognition, it's not separate to the voice, and it's not separate to Palmer Futures. So it very much all has to happen together. We think there are 4 key kind of areas of policy action that are needed: voice, empowerment, productivity, and closing the gap. Yep. So all of that is leading to this sort of one essential and pressing structural change that's required to put in place a comprehensive and cohesive new partnership between governments and Indigenous Australians, one that can empower Indigenous Australians at every level, especially at the regional and local level, where the real change to people's lives and futures must occur. So, my other key message is I think what we're doing is really hard. And I only learnt this last week. I'm no constitutional expert, but apparently Alfred Deakin was asked after Federation, how did you do it? And he cried and he said it was a miracle. It took a series of miracles. It was that hard. And as Shireen said, they were a bunch of white men, all with beards, just talking to each other. So I think it would be fair to say we're dealing with a much more complex environment now. We're dealing with what Noel described over the weekend as, these two warring mainstream tribes in the cultural wars in Australia and a highly polarised society. So we've got a huge job ahead of ourselves, I think, in terms of getting this done. So if we look at kind of how we align on how do we get there? On the voice, Indigenous people. Australian government's a bit wobbly at the moment, but there's still some hope. The Queensland government, they're talking treaty. We've got to get them to maybe line up and support voice concept first. Empowered communities, empowerment, the concept, I think Indigenous people are on board with that. Australian government is well behind that concept now. Queensland government, again, they're sort of off doing their own thing. So about 50-50 alignment to do this. It would be hard if everyone was perfectly aligned. So we've got some work to do there. So, So I thought this was a good note to end with. I mean, we do have to win hearts and minds for constitutional recognition to get over the line and for the voice to get up. I think there is a lot of fear in this space, as well as, I think there's never been a better opportunity than the opportunity we have now. I think the fear, some of the fear is people thinking this will never work, it'll be like ATSIC, it'll be a disaster, maybe Indigenous people can't get organised, or maybe there's some fear that Indigenous people will get organised too. But I think, so what we're asking people, ultimately, all Australians, to kind of vote with hope, not fear. But in our own work, and everyone in this room will be making a contribution to Pama Futures, I think we also have to approach our own work with that same sense of hope and not fear, because it is a great opportunity, never been a better opportunity, but it's also, somewhat precarious. Thanks.